Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute for Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. In a moment, we'll sit down with Dr. Clare Richardson-Barlow of the University of Leeds to discuss energy in the Indo-Pacific. But first, here are the latest developments from the world of geoeconomics. The European Union announced a set of substantive measures to build out its economic security strategy that was released last year in June. The package includes revisions to the Foreign Direct Investment Screening Program, outward investment screening, improving export controls for dual-use goods, expanding research and development, and research security. The potential measures would require the EU's 27 member states to revise their rules on each component proposed in order to harmonize in each member country's rules in these areas. The United States imposed financial sanctions, including asset and property freezes, on 4 Israeli individuals involved with violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. The targeted individuals would be prohibited from entering the United States and prohibits anyone residing in the United States or possessing U.S. citizenship from engaging in financial transactions with them. Germany and Japan signed an Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, or ACSA, on January 29th. It will facilitate sharing of military supplies and logistical support and allow use of each side's facilities during joint exercises. Negotiations on the pact began in September, and an agreement was reached in principle in December. Germany is the 7th country to sign an ACSA with Japan, following the United States, Australia, Britain, Canada, France, and India. A federal appeals court has blocked enforcement of a Florida law that would restrict Chinese citizens from buying land in Florida. While the court did not block the law in its entirety, it granted a preliminary injunction to 2 plaintiffs, allowing them to go ahead with their land purchase. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis approved the law last year during his presidential campaign, which prohibits Chinese who are domiciled in China and not lawful U.S. residents from buying or owning a single parcel of more than 2 acres, and which may not be within 5 miles of a U.S. military installation. Finally, the U.S. International Trade Commission determined that there is a reasonable indication of material injury to U.S. producers resulting from glass wine bottle imports from Chile, China, and Mexico. The ITC investigation found that these bottles were being sold at less than fair value and subsidized by the government of China. The ITC will now begin preliminary considerations on duties on glass wine bottle imports from these countries, with a preliminary decision on countervailing duties expected by March 25, 2024, and a preliminary decision on anti-dumping duties expected on June 6, 2024. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Clare Richardson-Barlow. She's a lecturer in East Asia at the University of Leeds, and she's agreed to join us to talk about energy in the Indo-Pacific. Clare, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul.
So, as somebody who lives in Tokyo, we are usually inundated with lots of bright lights. Everything is automated. The toilets are automated. Everything is automated. There seems to be plenty of electricity, as far as I can tell, as a non-energy person, to go around. So is there anything to worry about with energy in East Asia? It seems to be doing just fine.
I would say it really depends.
What is the landscape, I guess? Why are they worrying about this when it seems to be just fine?
It really depends on where you live and what part of energy you're concerned with. So we do have, of course, electricity concerns in every country. And that comes down to capacity, but also the energy sources that are providing your electricity. So your concerns in Japan or my concerns in the north of England might be very different when it comes to reliability and affordability than someone in, say, Indonesia, where there is not yet 100% electrification across the country. So on the electricity side, variable depending on the country, capacity, et cetera. But when we talk about energy, we're not just talking about electricity and keeping the lights on. We're also talking about kind of the heavy industry and the pressures that energy can put on carbonization or decarbonization, as we're commonly talking about, emissions and environmental impact. And then there's also, when we talk about energy, our access. What forms of energy do we have access to? How reliable is that access? And do we have diversification in our access and the forms of energy that we use? And that's where geopolitical events can put pressure. So I guess my roundabout answer would be, one, it depends. And two, the pressures and the challenges with energy are really variable based on what's going on both in your country, but also in the world at any given time.
So you make a really good point about how variable and how diverse it is, because what people have to remember is that the Indo-Pacific region is just absolutely huge. You've got wealthy countries like Japan and Singapore. You've got poor countries like Laos and various places, Cambodia here and there. So it is a little bit difficult to talk about the region, a singular region. Is that, in terms of energy, is that fair to say?
Yes, definitely. There is a diversity of demand and a diversity of national and regional and sub-regional situations. So when we talk about Asia Pacific, Northeast Asia, Japan, China, Taiwan, etc., Korea's looks very different to a conversation about what we call the CLMV or CLM countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And the challenges that those countries in Southeast Asia face are really very different from the challenges that you might be facing in Japan.
So how much cooperation, coordination, sharing is there? We hear a lot about economic initiatives to help integrate the region. What about on the energy side?
That is a great question. And the example you use, economic initiatives, is a really good parallel to make. So in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific broadly, there is a lot of cooperation, but a lot of the most effective cooperation is at sub-regional levels. So Northeast Asian cooperation, Southeast Asian cooperation, and then even smaller sub-levels in Southeast Asia, where you have countries that have similar circumstances in addition to the sort of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations cooperation. They're also cooperating in kind of hubs of 3 and 4. And that's similar to what we see with trade and bilateral versus multilateral cooperation. We're seeing a lot of bilateral and small multilateral cooperative groups around energy, as well as larger multilateral cooperation initiatives. And those are usually centered around institutions like ASEAN, who's really a driver of cooperation in Southeast Asia.
So is this enough? I mean, you already mentioned earlier that, not every place is up to 100% electrification. So what is this meeting the region's energy? Is this framework, is this approach meeting the region's energy demand? And if it's not, what's missing exactly?
Wow. I mean, I would say it is enough, but like everything with energy, the pressing need outweighs the speed of which change is happening. So if we were to forecast, say, what does the Indo-Pacific's energy landscape look like in 2024? It is very similar to 2023. There are some changes, but they are slow and they are gradual. And it depends on the factors that you're talking about, whether or not that change is really speeding up to a pace that we want when it comes to energy access and also decarbonization and sort of climate change mitigation.
Because I was going to ask, if you're trying to keep up with demand, that's probably going to push you rather easily to what's cheap and accessible and known. I'm talking about coal. You probably don't have the chance to wait for large-scale solar renewable platforms. You've got, just do whatever's quick and easy. So is that a big part of what's making up the gap?
Yeah, there's sort of three factors here. Rapid growth, urbanization, and industrialization are driving demand. And that is across the Indo-Pacific. So when it comes to energy access, and really when we talk about energy access, we're talking about quality of life. I know you know very well the kind of quality of life impacts that trade has. Energy is very similar. We're talking about medical access, education.
Can you maybe give some specific examples, like day-to-day life? How does energy impact how someone lives?
Yeah, in Southeast Asia, I would mention refrigeration of medical supplies. That's a huge thing. That impacts the health of communities quite greatly.
I was just going to say, this refrigeration of medical supplies is something that's missing in a lot of these places, is it?
It's, well, this is what electricity access gives us, right? So it would depend, it would depend on the rural location, but or the location. But when we talk about Southeast Asia, a lot of these countries are island nations with really rural and varied urbanization levels. So that is where electricity access plays an even bigger role, because you have medical supplies, but also reliable and affordable electricity. So are the lights on 100% of the day? For you and me in Japan and England, yes, absolutely. But in the Philippines and Indonesia, we're talking about, well, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, 97, 98, 99% electrification. So that still leaves tens or hundreds of thousands of people without reliable and affordable electricity access. And other impacts that are really specific, things like air conditioners. You know, what does your day look like when you are living in close to the equator, in a tropical environment with no electricity to power an air conditioner in a school? Those are the sorts of day-to-day aspects. And that can also impact water quality, food preparation, et cetera.
And I think the air conditioning thing is a really important thing to emphasize, because as the climate heats, you're not just talking about issues of comfort, you're talking about issues of health. You know, it's hard to live in 40-degree heat. I live in Tokyo in the summer. I can tell you very much. So yes, it is hard to live in 40-degree heat, but not only is it a question of, comfort, it's like you said, a question of food. It's a question of refrigeration with medical supplies. So this is massive, is your general point. This is a big part of people's welfare.
Absolutely. And I would even add to that if we wanted to take it a step further from welfare, heat impacts economic success. There is a correlation between your comfort and your ability to work. And that has economic impact that we can measure and we can see. So electricity access is both the day-to-day health, and it's also about economic growth and economic success, and also job opportunities, and all of those kind of add up to quality of life.
So this is the first time I've heard about a demonstrated link between comfort and cooler temperatures and economic productivity. Is this something that's pretty well established in the literature? I can tell you from my own experience, I am not nearly very productive as I am in the summer as I am in the winter. So, but this is borne out by the evidence. Early
evidence prior to sort of the modern comforts that we have today.
Okay. So this has a lot of impact for human health, human welfare, economic productivity. This goes well beyond just the bright shining lights of Shibuya or Shanghai or what have you. So if we want to, plug these countries into an energy grid, and we want to do so in a way that is clean and does not further contribute to climate change, what are the options? Okay, I'll put it this way. A, what are they trying to do? What are some of the more interesting, more creative initiatives that are out there? And two, what does, more in the big picture, what does the long-term macro perspective look like? Is this something that can happen without contributing to climate change?
It's a balance. So when we talk about the picture of the region, we have that rapid growth, urbanization, and industrialization really leading demand. But there's also the social challenge of climate change and environmental degradation. So sort of plugging in is no longer just about a traditional electricity grid. There is a lot of effort being made, particularly in Southeast Asia, where electrification is not at 100%. A lot of efforts being made to utilize alternative options like distributed energy systems for rural communities. So systems that are not connected to a national grid, because you're living in a country that's made up of multiple islands with different electricity access challenges as a result of distance to a grid, or also geographical challenges that might differ depending on where you live. So there are these sorts of alternative options popping up throughout the region and ASEAN, as well as a lot of national governments are playing a really big role, and subnational governments as well, in establishing more variety of options for electricity access. But there are also national, subnational, and regional targets for energy and the climate. And to go back to an earlier question that you had about the pace of change, no, it's not happening at the rate that we would, quote unquote, like to see for addressing climate change. But we have to balance that like human aspect with the social and political and sort of reality of environment and climate change. And on the kind of broader region and what's happening, targets are being set and electricity access is improving, but it is undeniable that energy is going to continue to be addressed via hydrocarbon resources that have an environmental impact. The West and the majority of the world would like to see lessen quite a lot. And so it's sort of a wishy-washy answer there. Change is happening and there is effort, but not happening at the pace we would like. And there's going to continue to be a hydrocarbon element, largely coal, oil, and natural gas in the region.
So what is missing here? Is this a question of money? Is this just a question of simply building these cleaner power plants? And of course, that begs the question of who pays. Is it a question of technology, where we have to wait for some of these greener energy sources to become, viable and scalable? Is it just a question of domestic politics? Are these oil firms, coal firms, what have you, hydrocarbon firms? Is this a kind of, rent seeking, rent taking? What's the barrier to speeding up the pace here? Because the population probably isn't going to go down anytime soon. Demand for energy isn't going to go down anytime soon. So you turn to supply. So what's the hope there? What are the odds?
Well, broadly, on the region as a whole, the technology exists. The energy sources are scalable. We're seeing success all throughout the region, but financing needs to be increased. And there is a gap between what is happening for emerging markets versus more established markets. We are also seeing that there is a lot of technology advancement happening in the region and its subregions. And so on the success side, countries are doing a lot, and they are seeing an increase in renewables. They're seeing a decrease in hydrocarbons, but it depends on the country we're talking about. So Indonesia, for example, there is a very integrated hydrocarbon economy. Brunei as well. And so you're battling with national politics and vested interests. And we see this in a variety of countries, not just Indo-Pacific, but Western as well, that in Europe and throughout the Americas, there is often a disconnect between national targets and local governments and political will. And when it comes down to voting, we are talking about improving the quality of life or maintaining quality of life for voters. And that means that there are often considerations around energy sources that don't match up with the narrative about transitioning from hydrocarbons. And we see that even in the UK. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, financing is a huge part. And this is where multilateral financing initiatives can be really helpful, although there's a lot of critique of the current options that exist, like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs, as they're referred to, which are essentially partnerships for established economies, industrialized economies, to contribute to the funding of energy projects that are renewable or trend towards clean, quote unquote, and also have an element of justice and access and equitability in them. But there are issues with transparency and accountability and kind of how we monitor these programs that are fair criticisms. And then, we need to see, as everywhere, increases in private sector investment and real national commitments that follow through with limits on carbon emissions or certain energy sources. And that means phasing things out and perhaps not building new plants where possible. But of course, I say all of this as a Western woman in a country where I never have to question if the lights will turn on versus the, real day-to-day experience of someone that is living in a community that's using a distributed energy system that might experience occasional brownouts. And so my, comments about phasing things out are really based around the experience of my energy access and the country in which I live. But there is definitely an argument to be made for national governments targeting some of these phase outs more aggressively.
If I could just go back to one of the things you mentioned at the very beginning of your answer, you talked about some of the more local, national level successes. Could you offer an illustrative example of what is it? Where did it come about? Just a few words to elaborate on one of those things.
Yeah, I'll continue to use the example of Indonesia because I've pointed out some of the negatives of Indonesia's energy transition. Those exist, but Indonesia also has some really great programs focused on rural electricity access and bringing reliable electricity access to communities that is not just dropped in and then left, but actually plays a role in the community's economic success and economic growth. And those distributed energy systems are funded by national utilities. They're a combination of public-private partnerships that increase training for maintaining these distributed energy systems and offer opportunities for some of these communities that have really rural access to increase their electricity usage and the reliability and affordability of their electricity. And as a result, we see infrastructure growing out of these communities and linking them more significantly to neighboring areas, which grows the economic opportunities for largely, we're seeing an increase in opportunities for women outside of the home. And then also health and quality of life improvements because of the impact these distributed energy systems have on water, medical access, trade, et cetera.
So if these things have been so successful and they sound fairly common sense from what you've described, why isn't this the thing? Why is this something that I'm only hearing about today as opposed to a region-wide template?
Well, I think that, that's multifaceted. Capacity and also will not just political, but like industry will. How big is the market? If we're talking about a community that's a couple hundred people, the incentive for utilities to engage in this sort of public-private partnership might be smaller than the low-hanging fruit of increasing access around major cities. And so I think we're seeing kind of a gradual change and move towards these alternative arrangements. And hopefully, because there is success in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia with these projects, these types of partnerships, we're going to see these sort of snowball and get bigger and play a bigger role elsewhere.
So finally, last question. This is the Geoeconomic Agenda, so I'll ask a question about geopolitics. What are the big geopolitical shocks that this region might be vulnerable to? Japan in particular has had to face the question of weaning itself off of natural gas from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. I'm assuming Japan is not alone in having those challenges, those uncertainties about energy imports or energy exports, as the case may be, trying to do business with countries that may be out of favor or bad actors. What are some of the shocks? What are some of the concerns as this region thinks about energy and the wider world?
It's such an interesting topic, and it's so relevant to kind of the global but also regional landscape. Russia is definitely at the top of the list. The same challenges that Japan faced with the Russia-Ukraine war, Southeast Asia and other parts of Northeast Asia and South Asia are also facing. And have had to come to terms with. And that's really a big lesson, but a repeating lesson when it comes to energy. We saw this with the Middle East in the 1990s and the 2000s, that a diversification of supply and suppliers is really necessary for what we tend to refer to as energy security, which is security of supply and security of access. Right. So Russia is at the top of that, but any other global conflicts can have knock-on effects on energy markets. And that's a result of both the supply, so whether it's a country like Russia, or maybe it's a knock-on impact from a country that is a large importer of oil or gas, and then as a result plays a large kind of regional hub energy role, but also geopolitical impacts of the global movement to address climate change and decarbonize.
Of course.
That can include things like move towards carbon markets and UN resolutions or Conference of the Party resolutions towards increasing responses to climate change and decreasing hydrocarbon usage. And then, conflicts related to trade and economics can also have knock-on impacts on energy markets. So, for example, conflict in the South China Sea, that can have an impact on trade, because we're not just talking about territory with that potential site of conflict. We're also talking about the movement of goods and services via trade, and the impacts that can have, trade routes can have on the movement of energy resources from one place in the world to another. And some of the solutions are pretty common and related to regional or local access to supply, as opposed to shipping from, say, Russia. So Indonesia stepping up and providing resources, or Brunei, although that's on a very small scale. So there will still be regional and sub-regional impacts. And a lot of this comes down to diversity of resources that are used. And so that's where renewable energy can play a really big role. And that's where renewable energy trade and electricity trade can play a really big role, making sure that you're not over-relying on one resource in case something happens geopolitically that would limit your access to that resource.
Okay, Dr. Clare Richardson-Barlow, thanks so much for joining us today. This is a space that I'm sure we're going to be returning to in the future, and it was a very interesting chance to get your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting conversation, and of course, you asked excellent questions to make this a really useful discussion.
I'll appreciate that. I'll put that on my resume even. Okay, thank you so much. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. The year 1177 BCE has been called the year civilization collapsed. The Bronze Age collapse, as it's been called, was a period of widespread, sudden, and violent turmoil that was the end of major civilizations like Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire in Turkey and the Levant. It dealt crippling blows to empires in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and literally changed the course of human history. Because of gaps in the archaeological records and in written records, we'll never know for certain what entirely happened and why, but in keeping with the purview of the podcast, it's worth asking if economic interdependence was a contributing factor. As the name indicates, bronze was a critical material for the world economy at this time. The metal was used for tools, weapons, building materials, and more, and the knowledge of making bronze was a key intellectual property of the era. Production required a specific ratio of tin and bronze to be combined in the correct sequence and at the correct temperatures, otherwise it would be too brittle and might break. Importantly, making bronze was almost impossible without trade. Copper and tin, the two metals of which bronze is made up, aren't widely occurring. Copper would likely have been sourced from Cyprus or Greece, but tin is more rare and would have needed to be shipped to the Eastern Mediterranean from places like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, Central Asia, or the Near East. For example, the Uluburun shipwreck found off the southern coast of Turkey and dated to the Bronze Age carried raw copper and tin. The copper was sourced from Cyprus, while the tin was sourced from two places, some from modern Uzbekistan and the rest from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. But these trade routes would have been disrupted as the Bronze Age collapse got underway. The governments that protected the trade routes which carried these metals would have collapsed or would have become distracted by more immediate threats, and production couldn't have continued without steady supplies of the component materials required, cutting back manufacture of the tools and materials that societies of the time depended on, which in turn would have disrupted economic activity and agriculture, and all contributing to the cascading effects that made the Bronze Age collapse so devastating and disruptive. The lesson is that the risks of interdependence aren't completely new, and even if these risks are more comprehensive today, they impacted ancient societies in similar ways to the disruptions that people experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more underway. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show, so send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.